and the chat gets saved with that. Hi, let's see who we've got here. Barbara and Connor. Mike Hamza, Rob Tiedemann, welcome everybody, welcome. I'm Liz Paul, I'm the coordinator of the Boise River Enhancement Network. Thank you, Peter Anderson and Josiba. Thank you very much, you guys. Excellent. If people can please open up the chat and put your name and say hi to everybody. You can do a private chat if you see somebody that's showing up here on our program today who you haven't seen for a while, or maybe you've seen them recently. You can do a little private chat also and say hi to folks, your friends. We miss being able to see everybody in person, so we do want to let people have a little bit of time to say hi to each other. Ted, welcome. Sam Box from Real Applied Science and Engineering, awesome. Hi, John McLean, good to have you here on our Zoom call again. Another Connor. Oh, Connor. Well, this program will help you become a better fly fisherman. At least you'll have a little bit more of the fish brain after this one. Excellent. We're going to give folks just another couple minutes. Another couple minutes to come in, and then I'm going to start a poll. I have a feeling if I start it before people are in, then they won't be able to see it. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Robert. Good to see you here today. Okay, so again, this is our Zoom program for our program today, our special program, Fish of the Boise River, with our guest speaker, John Cassenelli. He's the regional fisheries biologist with Idaho Fish and Game. You'll hear a little bit more about him in just a second. And I'm going to put a poll up if I can get back to there we go. And you should be able to see the poll on your screen. And there's just 3 pretty simple questions, just so we gather a little bit of information. So go ahead and vote in the poll as soon as you see it there pop up on your screen. Thank you, that's right. Excellent, welcome everybody to our program today, Fish of the Boise River. We are asking you to multitask, fill out, answer the questions in the poll. And if you haven't already said hello and written your name down in the chat box, we would love you to do that as well. I'm Liz Paul, the coordinator of the Boise River Enhancement Network, and we have moved all of our programming like this online for the time being. And we miss seeing everybody in person at our in-person brown bag programs. All right, looks like just about everybody has voted. And that's excellent. All right, I'm going to organize my screen a little bit here. Hi, Gail. Good to see you. Welcome to the meeting today. We have a couple great volunteers working with us today. Cassidy Connolly is opening the door to everybody from the waiting room, and she's also going to be monitoring the chat. If people have questions or problems come up, Cassidy will be paying attention to what's going on in the chat. And Cassidy is the chair of the Brand Outreach Committee. So she's the one that keeps us all together and helps us get these programs up and running. And then I am going to introduce now Jane Kreller, who's also a member of the Bren coordinating team and on the outreach committee. And let's see here. There's Jane. Let me get to my next screen here. Today's program is sponsored by the Boise River Enhancement Network and Idaho Fish and Game. And take it away, Jane.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. This is a great way to do this. So back by popular demand, this is the fish of the Boise River. And we're joined by John Cassenelli from the Idaho Fish and Game Southwest Region Fisheries. And just to give you a little bit of an overview about us, we're a network of people that live, work, and play in the Boise River watershed. And we are dedicated to promoting the ecological enhancement of the river. Please go and sign up for our mailing list. It's free and it gives you access to news of when events like this are happening. It keeps you up to date. And there's also an opportunity to donate. So Boise River Enhancement Network is a 501c3. They do outstanding work in the community. You know, giving your money this way is going to produce tangible results in the area. Just can't speak highly enough of the Boise River Enhancement Network. So go check out the website and sign up. So now I'd like to introduce you to John. He's back. This is one of his most popular courses and really excited to learn more about the fish of the Boise River.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm getting my all my stuff lined up here, so give me just a sec. I will share my screen. All right, hopefully everybody can see this and we're good to go. Okay.
That's great, John. We can see your screen. Take it away. Thanks a million.
Perfect. All right, well, I appreciate the opportunity to give this talk again, and I appreciate Bren for putting this together. Gave this talk at the Star Library, it's been a couple months ago, and we had a packed house there, and folks seem to enjoy it, and so I appreciate the opportunity to give it again. I've given lots of presentations over the years, but I think this is the first one I've ever given sitting down, and I thought about standing up in my office, but I figured I'd start pacing around and not be by the microphone. You wouldn't be able to hear me. So I'm going to do it from a seated position and hope for the best. But yes, my name is John Cassenelli. I'm the Regional Fisheries Manager for the Southwest region of Idaho Fish and Game. So, you know, our region goes over to roughly Mountain Home, down to the Nevada border, over to the Oregon border, and then up to Oxbow Reservoir on the Snake, and we also have the Payette up to about Banks. And so that's kind of the geographic area of fisheries that I manage. I have two biologists that work for me. A lot of you have seen and met Tim D'Amico. He's been on for a little over a year, and he's our Boise River biologist. He handles kind of all of our cold water fisheries, the Boise and the Payette. And then we have Cindy Now, who covers most of the southern part of our region, a lot of the warm water fisheries, but she also does some cold water stuff with red bands and the Owyhees, that sort of thing. So we're basically a three-person shop with myself and the two bios, and always available to chat, answer questions. Feel free to get a hold of us at any time. That's why we're here. And so with that being said, I'm going to dive right into my talk today and talk to you guys about the lower Boise River. And so we use the term lower Boise River quite a bit in our shop. And I guess just to give you a little bit of point of context, when I talk about the lower Boise River, I'm talking about that roughly 64-mile stretch from Lucky Peak Dam down to the confluence with the Snake. This stretch of river is really kind of broken down into two sections. We've got what we call the cold water section, which is from immediately below the dam down to about Middleton. And then once you get down that far, the river kind of starts to warm up and you get this mixing zone. And then as you get down towards Caldwell, down to the confluence with the Snake, it really becomes more of a warm water fishery. And so for most of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on this cold water section. I will briefly talk about the lower river further down in the warm water section down there. And so we're really talking about kind of from Lucky Peak down here to about Middleton and that cold water reach. So I always like to point out when we talk about the lower Boise that this is indeed a working multi-use river. You think of all the uses of the Boise River, from recreation, whether it's rafting, the float section from Barber down, whether it's kayaking at the kayak or at the wave shaper features around Esther Simplot. Of course, we have lots of anglers on the river, and then there's lots of water taken from the river for various irrigation, whether it's agricultural or domestic irrigation. So the river has roughly 30 dams and diversions on it in this lower section. And then just talking about a little bit of kind of how the valley's changing and what goes on with that water. So the U.S. Department of Ag puts out information on a roughly 5-year basis. Their most recent report is from 2017. And in that report, it identifies just over 4,400 operations that harvested crops from nearly 756,000 irrigated acres in the Boise watershed. If you go back to their most recent report prior to that in 2012, you'll see that the number of irrigated acres decreased by about 25,000, and the number of operators producing in the valley was reduced by about 280. And so when that next report comes out in around 2022, we fully anticipate seeing these numbers continue to drop, and that's mainly due to the valley growth. Folks around the valley, it's not foreign to them to see all of these subdivisions and housing developments going up on the fringes of places like Meridian and Nampa, where farmland is turning into developed land. And so the current Treasure Valley population is just over 700,000 people. From 2017 to 2018, according to Forbes, Boise was the fastest growing city in the country. And it's also been ranked as one of the best US cities to buy a house in as recent as 2019. And so none of us are surprised by these numbers. We all see it every day with the growth that's going on in the valley. And of course, when you have a river that's the lifeblood of the valley and supplying a lot of vital services to the valley, this changing dynamic also kind of changes how the river's used and how we monitor the river. The other thing I like to do is give people a little bit of a historical context of the Boise River. So the river itself, pre-settlement, was known as a prolific fishery. We're talking pre-1900s. So before the Hells Canyon Dam complex went in and the river was an open river from Boise down to the Columbia, we had prolific returns of salmon and steelhead. We had lamprey even in the Boise River and other salmonids. The picture you see on the left here is an artist rendering of Fort Boise. And this is a pretty old drawing, and yet you see that the artist included an angler in that drawing sitting along the banks of the Boise River fishing. The other picture that you see here is of two ladies that have a steelhead. You can tell this is spring. The water's clear up into the cottonwoods. This is high flows when these fish would come back. And they've got, it looks like a fly rod, a nice steelhead on there, and another person netting it. So always kind of interesting to look at the historic context of what the river looked like from a fisheries perspective before a lot of the changes that have occurred. So by the time we get to the 1960s, which is where we start to see a lot of documentation talking about the state of the river is obviously pretty well degraded. William Webb did a report in 1964, and if you read his report, it's almost written kind of like a novel. He's got some very colorful language and descriptions in there. And I pulled a couple of his quotes out of his report where he talked about the Boise River being muddy and sluggish, with silt beds of decomposing matter, and talking about at times that the river runs red from blood from slaughterhouses. And so a lot of the industry along the Boise at that time was just dumping stuff right into the river. And so there was a lot of degradation going on. You can see here, this is a picture of logging on the Boise River. So a lot of cottonwoods were removed for building purposes and for logging purposes. We've got another picture over here of a vehicle sitting under what I believe is Broadway Bridge. Somehow that car ended up in the river, and you got an officer. It looks like he's citing the driver. And so lots going on in the river, and the river's not in great shape by mid-century. So as far as Fish and Game's perspective, our first known thorough survey of the river was done in the early 1970s. So in 1974, we conducted a survey, found that there was 24 species of fish in the river, but only 6% of those were sport fish. The majority of game fish or sport fish that were in the river at that time were smallmouth bass and hatchery rainbow trout. And so people kind of think of smallmouth bass now, they're pretty prolific in a lot of our rivers, and they think that that's more of a more recent kind of encroachment or introduction, but we've had bass around since the 70s, and they were in the river clear back then. And one of the most telling things from this survey was that they found really few wild trout. And that's important as I talk about the fishery in its current state and going forward, because it's mainly supported by wild trout now, and back then it was not. We still put a lot of hatchery fish in the river as we did back then, but they're not nearly as prolific now as they once were. And so out of this 1974 survey, there was really two recommendations that came out of that. One was to manage the lower Boise as two fisheries, which we continue to do to this day. We've got a cold water fishery and a warm water fishery. I already talked about those. And the other recommendation was that we develop some minimum flows, and I will talk a little bit about that moving forward. So a few other things that kind of changed the course of the river and started heading us in the direction of where we are today were the Clean Water Act of 1972. So temperature and suspended sediment criteria, improved ag and industrial practices. So just technological advances over time on how we treat wastewater and stormwater. Agricultural practices has improved and how we irrigate, what runoff looks like, the pesticides and herbicides that are used in those applications. All of those things have obviously evolved and changed over time for the better, and that's improved the water quality of the river. But of course, the other big one was the establishment of a winter maintenance flows in the mid-1980s. So prior to that establishment, after Lucky Peak had gone in, winter flows or water designated for winter flows or maintenance flows in the Boise River were pretty low. And so the river was often getting down to 50 CFS, less than 100 CFS in the wintertime. And that was really a choke point or a detrimental time period for our wild trout populations. And so starting in the mid-1980s and moving forward, that was bumped up to about 150 CFS. In the early 90s, it was bumped up to 240 CFS, which is where it currently stands today. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how we're working to bump that up even more right now and using a little bit more water in the wintertime to further help our trout populations. So this is always kind of fun to show people and talk about the channel in the Boise River. And so if you drive across the Boise River now in town and you've got all these cottonwoods and you'll see some islands and you'll see riffles and runs and pools. And you think, well, that's a pretty natural looking river and it looks like it's in pretty good shape. But when you go back and look at the historical context, this picture on the left is from 1936. And so the barren ground that you see to the right, on the right side of the photo, that's basically the Boise State Campus. This is Capitol Boulevard right here. That's Broadway up there. Zoo Boise would be right here right now. And you can see that this pretty much looks like the New York Canal or a lot of her big canals that occur in the valley right now. There's levees on both sides. And it's just a channelized canal, basically, where the river is no longer in its natural state. And you look at that and you think, well, that's not a very functional river. And it's crazy that it once looked like that. And so you fast forward to I think this picture on the right was taken in the early 1960s. Now we're looking from upriver, downriver. This is Broadway here. You can see Capitol Bridge off in the distance. This is the Boise State Campus. That's what Bronco Stadium used to look like before it looks like what it did now. That's where currently Bronco Stadium sits. And you can see that we've still very much got that same channelized river. The only difference is we've started to get some islands forming in the channel. The cottonwoods have started to come back along the levees. And it's kind of made some ground, but it's still very much in that same channel. And so now fast forward to current date and looking at this same stretch of river from an aerial view. Again, this is West Park Center Bridge. There's Broadway, there's Capitol down there. Zoo Boise would be in all these trees here. And of course, you've got the Boise State Campus and Bronco Stadium. And you can see while we've got a lot of riparian vegetation, we've got some islands now and some channel morphology that's changed, the river still very much is within those same original levees that were in that same picture from the 30s, and it's still very much a channelized, altered river. And so even though we've come a long ways in improving the riparian habitat, we still are dealing with that channelized, urbanized environment in our Boise River through town. So moving on, that's kind of my history lesson or my background information, and I'm going to move on to what we work on and what we do, and that's the fishery in the Boise River. That's obviously the component that my group studies and regulates, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about. So most notably the tailwater fishery. So the reason that we've got kind of this cold water trout fishery that exists from Lucky Peak down to that Middleton transition zone is because it's a tailwater fishery, and most of your large river kind of high quality trout fisheries that exist in the United States, and especially in the Western United States, are indeed tailwater fisheries because those upstream reservoirs provide the cold water influence throughout the year to keep temperatures in the range to support a cold water fishery. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to tailwater fisheries, because you get that cold water source to create the fishery in the first place, but you also deal with the reservoir releases, be it flood control or irrigation deliveries, that are altered from the river's native state and change your flow pattern and become a little bit of an obstacle. And so I'll touch on both of those things as we move forward. Numerous game and non-game species in the river. And so one of the things I like to point out when I give these talks is I've had people come up to me after and they've watched my entire talk thinking that I had like downloaded some Google images of fish from other rivers and put them in here. And that's not the case. Every picture that's in this presentation that I'm going to show you today are from fish in the Boise River that we have taken ourselves through our surveys or gotten from anglers. So every fish that you see is from the lower Boise, and we've got, as far as game fish, we've got rainbow trout, which you see up here, we've got brown trout, and we've got mountain whitefish. I will point out that the only ones that are native of these three are the mountain whitefish. Of course, rainbow trout, red bands, and steelhead are native to the Boise, and there's still a little bit of carryover genetics from those fish that we'll see from time to time. But the important thing I like to point out to people is that for the most part, the rainbows in the lower Boise are of coastal origin that were introduced via hatcheries over the years. And so if you run genetic analyses of these nice big plump rainbows in the lower Boise, most of those fish have coastal genetics. And so always important to differentiate between wild trout and native trout. These fish are all wild trout. They're born and raised in the river, but they aren't necessarily native trout. Sculpins, of course, a couple different kinds, short head mottled. We've got northern pike minnow, we've got red side shiners, speckled bass, and a couple species of suckers that will come up into the cold water section, mostly large scale, which are these big guys that you see. We'll have some bridge lip suckers in there as well. So that's kind of what the species assemblage looks like in that cold water reach. And it also is home to quality salmonids. People are often surprised when they see these pictures to know that this is the type of fish that you can find in the Boise River right through town. This picture of Tim and Kevin Meyer, who also works for us out of our research shop. This is a pair of brown trout that we caught, in a male and a female that we caught doing our fall surveys just this most recent year, and that's right at Barber Park. And so there are some quality big fish in the river, and there's also some really nice whitefish throughout the river. They're kind of the forgotten about game fish. You don't run into too many anglers that are out there targeting whitefish, but whitefish can be pretty fun to catch if you kind of know what you're doing and target them. And there are some trophy quality whitefish in the river as well. So on to the monitoring that we do, and I'll talk about a handful of studies. We do a lot of work in the lower Boise, and the reason being is because it's so popular and it's in the most urbanized area in Idaho, and so we're constantly monitoring that population and trying to figure out ways to improve that fishery. And so these are three big ongoing monitoring studies that we do, and I'll talk about all of them in a little more detail here over the next few minutes, but we do triennial mark recapture. So triennial meaning those surveys are done every 3 years, where we go out with our electrofishing canoe. We've got 3 trend sites that we do abundance on, and we did those most recently in 2019. If you're ever around the Boise River, usually the 2nd or 3rd week in October, and you see a whole bunch of people out in the river with a generator making a bunch of noise and a bunch of nets netting fish, that is these surveys that are going on. We look at adult distribution through raft electrofishing. That was done in 2016 and 17 and will be repeated in 2020. And that's looking at trout distribution. We're also tagging fish to look at catch per unit effort and get at angler use and harvest of our fish in the river. And then another one that's gone on for about the last 5 years is our shoreline fry sampling that we do each fall. This one's been really telling and important to get us reproductive information for our wild trout in the river. We've got a bunch of sites that we do, and I'll talk more about that as well. So to get into the triennial mark recapture, this is your typical October weather in Boise, where we're standing in a snowstorm, and off in the distance you can see blue skies. But this picture was taken right in front of the boat launch at Barber Park, and so this is our system of capturing adult. Well, not just adult. It's not real effective at catching the smallest age classes of fish, but we catch pretty much everything over 100 millimeters. We're pretty effective at catching. And so you've got this canoe that's got the canoe itself acts as an anode, and then you've got these 3 throw probes. You can only see 2 of them in this picture. The other person is off camera. And you can see that they have lines with floats. And basically, you're working down the river as a team with those 3 probes, throwing those probes in the water. They create electrical current that stuns the fish. You've got 7 to 8 netters lined up across below you. And as those fish get stunned, they net them. They dump them in this live well that's full of oxygen. And as we move downriver and that tub gets filled up, we'll stop and work up the fish and then release them upriver and continue to move down through our sections. Each section's about 1 kilometer long. And so these surveys have been going on since 2004. We have trend sites from Barber all the way down to Eagle Island. So there's 2 in Boise and then the one down at Eagle Island. We do duplicate surveys a week apart. So when I say mark recapture, we go through on our marking run, which is our first pass. And every fish that we encountered gets a hole punch in its caudal fin. So this is just your run-of-the-mill Office Max paper hole punch that we pop a hole in their tail. That'll eventually grow back and fill in, but it's an obvious mark that stays there for a while. And so then when we go back through and do our recapture run a week later, and catch all the fish that we can catch again, we can then look at the ratio of marked to unmarked fish. And you plug all that into some fancy software that does some math, and really the math is not all that complicated. It's pretty basic, and you can come up with a population estimate based on how many fish you marked, how many fish you recaptured, and how many fish were unmarked in your second run. And that gives us a population estimate for these trend sites over time.
Hey, John.
Yep.
This is Liz. So we did get a question to explain just in a little more detail about electrofishing.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about, I guess, 3 different types of electrofishing here. So this is one type, this canoe electrofishing. You're going to see examples of 2 more types of electrofishing. And so you think about game management and how you manage wildlife. We fly around in helicopters, we look down, we count the animals. There's various ways of seeing animals that exist on the ground, right? It's all about knowing what's there. Fish, you can't just kind of look at water and see the fish that are in there. That's not an easy thing to do. Fish hide in dark places and in deep water. And so really when it comes to fish, observing the fish that are present, we either have to find a way to capture those fish, and that's often done with nets or electricity. You can also sometimes snorkel certain waters, and in places where electricity is not effective, we'll do that. Places like the North Fork, Boise. Or you have to do like spawning ground surveys and look at the number of reds that were dug, and then you can kind of get at adults that way. But I guess in flowing waters, our most effective tool is electrofishing, and it's just putting an electric current in the water. And you'll notice everybody in this picture is wearing gloves and waders, and so it stuns the electric current just stuns the fish. And so putting the current in the water, the fish is stunned, they float to the surface, you net them, you put them in a tub, and basically that's a way to inventory the entirety of a fish population in a given stretch of water. And so that's one of, if not the most widely used fish survey techniques in all of probably the world, especially in North America. And so we have various ways of getting that current into the water based on how much water we're dealing with and what we're after, and I'll talk about those going forward. But that's basically what electrofishing is in a nutshell, is a way for us to survey and get our hands on the fish. The other benefit of course, electrofishing is that you're getting the fish in hand, so you can take length and weight measurements and get measurements off the fish, where if you're doing something like snorkeling or red surveys, those sorts of surveys, you're not getting fish in hand and not getting the biological data associated with those fish. Hopefully that answered your question. I'm not going to show you guys a ton of graphs today because I think graphs can get a little overwhelming, but I did want to show you a little bit of data. And so the graph on the left is just showing for our reaches what the fish size structure looks like. And so you'll see we're not as super effective at getting the small fish, but in a place like the habitat reach, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, that's the new habitat improvements we did just below the Eckert Bridge. We got a lot of small fish in there. You can see basically you're seeing age classes here, then you move up to these 10 to 12 inch fish. There's always a lot of those guys. And then of course you get up into the bigger fish and you see various numbers of those existing in different age classes as you go down through the river. I guess one of the things that jumped out to us in 2019, I wouldn't say it's alarming, but we were surprised to see it, and it's something we need to pay attention to, is ever since we started these surveys, I mentioned the current survey format started in 2004, but we actually had some other data going back to the early to mid 90s. And we've been seeing basically an increase in trend in our rainbow trout population over time. And then it was kind of holding steady through 2016. And then when we went out in 2019, and all of a sudden we've seen that rainbow trout population drop a little bit. And so again, I don't know that we're alarmed by that, but we were a little surprised to see that drop in density. And so that's something we're going to pay attention to going forward. Brown trout densities are always much lower in the Boise, and there's various reasons for that. And I'll talk about a little bit of that later when it comes to the fry surveys, but always lower densities of brown trout, and they tend to jump around. The other thing I guess I'll explain or help explain is people see this and say, okay, at its height in 2010, we were seeing about 8 fish per 100 meters squared. This most recent year, we were seeing about 3 to 4 fish per 100 meters squared. And people have a hard time kind of understanding what that means. And I guess for context, in the South Fork Boise, we'll see a lot of times around 10, 11, 12 fish per 100 meters squared. Over in the South Fork Snake on the eastern side of the state, which is one of the more prolific trout fisheries in the country, they'll see 13 to 14 fish per 100 meters squared. And I guess to help you visualize that, the thing I always like to do is show a track lane. So you think of a 100-meter dash, each one of these track lanes is 100 meters long by 1 meter wide. So that individual track lane is 100 meters squared. And so when we say 8 fish at the most, 4 fish most recently, we're saying there'd be 8 fish in that entire lane. And so if you look at a track that's 9, this track right here is 9 meters wide. So that's 9 by 100 meters. That's about what the Boise River is in a lot of places. And so you're almost looking at a 100-meter stretch of what the Boise River would look like. So our highest densities, we would see roughly 70 trout in that entirety of that stretch of river. Right now, we're seeing more like 30 trout in that stretch of river. And so these densities fluctuate over time, but I always like to try to give people a little bit of a visual of what fish per 100 meters squared actually means. So just to give you a little summary of what I've just talked about with these triennial surveys, we saw a sharp increase in wild rainbow densities from 94 to 2010, and then from 10 to 16, those densities stabilized. We've seen a drop in densities in 2019, and that's something that we're going to pay attention to. I'll talk about a study we're doing this year to maybe help get at some of that. Average wild rainbow trout size continues to increase slightly over time, and you can see we've got this big trophy component. There are these trophy fish that exist in the river, and average size has gone up a little bit. And then the wild brown trout remains a minor component in this reach, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a minute. So moving on to our raft surveys, now we've moved on to a second type of electrofishing. So for these surveys, we wanted to go out. I mentioned that we do the canoe surveys in October. The reason we do those in October is the river's low. We're able to get out, wade around, get all our netters out there, and capture fish. We wanted to go out in the summertime and capture some fish and put some tags in those fish to see what angler use of our wild trout population was like. And so to do that, we did this in 2016 and 17. We're going to repeat this in 2020. We use a raft electrofishing unit. So in this setup, basically you're still putting electricity in the water. Your anodes are hanging off the side of the boat right here. Your cathode is off the front of the boat. That's creating electrical current as you float down. Your oarsman's kind of keeping you along the shoreline for the most part, or you're running in tandem with two boats because you're in deeper water. These surveys are done in June, and so it's a little tougher to pull fish out of deep water. And then you've got your power source, your generator on the back of the raft, and you've got a netter that stands on the bow of the raft, and they're netting all the fish as they come up, putting them in a live well, similar to what we did in the canoe, filling up these live well with fish, and then they'll stop and work them up and put these floy tags in the fish. And so this was completed, and I said 16 and 17, I lied, it was 15 and 16. Those were the years that we did the first go around. We're gonna repeat it in 2020. We're hoping to do the entirety of it in 2020. If we can't, we will, we'll do some of it in 2021 as well. We've got 12 reaches that we do this in, all the way from Highway 21 Bridge down to Middleton. And basically we're tagging wild trout to evaluate angler use and harvest. And so all of those little tags that I showed you in the previous slide, they get stuck through the dorsal fin rays of these fish. Each one of these tags is uniquely numbered. It's got a website and a phone number on it. And so anglers that encounter these fish, you know, if they keep the fish or if they release the fish, they're able to report the tag number, and we can get at what the use is of our wild trout population throughout the river. And then we also compared catch per unit effort and species composition from our raft capture as we went down through the river. So one of the things that we did find was that 84% of the fish population was wild rainbow trout, 14% was brown trout, and then we had 2% of the fish that we encountered were hatchery rainbow trout. As far as distribution, this one always surprises people a little bit. Keep in mind, this is done in June when waters was still fairly high and cold. And so trout are pretty well distributed that time of year. If you look at the top panel, that's rainbow trout. The bottom panel is brown trout. And then it's just catch per unit effort on the side. And so Canada is here, star, you're moving up to Eagle, Plantation, Americana. Basically, you're moving from downriver to upriver as you go left to right on this graph. And you can see that for the rainbows, you know, people always think that they're kind of just in this section up around Boise, but we saw some of our highest catch per unit effort of rainbows that time of year down in the South Channel around Star and the South Channel around Eagle. So pretty good distribution of rainbows. Brown trout, again, people kind of think that they're more focused on the lower river, but we saw quite a few in the upper river too. And that changes a little bit as the year progresses and these fish stage to spawn. You'll see more of those rainbows moving into the upper stretches and more of those brown concentrating down in the lower stretches. But fish are pretty uniformly distributed throughout this cold water stretch. Then the other key that we got out of this, we tagged several hundred fish, and we found that only about 16% of our wild brown trout were caught, and of those we had 0% harvest. And only about 6% of our wild rainbow trout were caught, and of those we had about 2.5% harvest. And these numbers correlate pretty well with a creel survey that Lance Hebden did back in the early 2000s, and his creel survey found some percentages that were really close. And so for the most part, we think that harvest is a minimal impact on the wild trout in the Boise River. But, you know, this valley is growing exponentially, as we talked about, and more people are fishing the river. and you go to the access points and you see more and more cars. And so we want to stay on top of this and make sure, you know, most of the river is a general reg. We've got the special reg between the park center bridges, but outside of that, the majority of the river is general regulation. So every angler that goes out there by law can keep 6 fish if they want to. And so we don't want to get ourselves in a situation where, you know, with valley growth and increased pressure, that all of a sudden, you know, we got a lot of people keeping fish and they're starting to impact our trout population. So we're going to take another look at this year. And it's something that we're going to continue to look at going forward. On to the fry surveys. This one's kind of one of my favorites because it's told us a lot that we previously didn't know about fish reproduction in the Boise, and we've gotten a lot of cool data from it. So this is my third type of electrofishing. That is not a Ghostbuster in the top left. That is a backpack electrofishing unit. And so these units are backpack units, the generator, battery, everything's on your back. You're holding the anode in your hand, you're dragging a cable that's the cathode down by your feet, you're wearing gloves and waders so you don't get zapped, and you're putting a smaller electric current through the water than you would be with those bigger raft and canoe setups. And you're working along the shoreline in shallower water, and you're stunning a lot of the smaller fish. This is the type of survey we'll do in small streams, you know, when we go out to the Owyhees to shock red bands, or we go up in the Boise Mountains to shock smaller streams. These backpack electrofishing units are what you'll typically see. So we do from the shoreline out to about 4 meters in the channel. We've got 61 sites in the main stem. We've got some tributary sites and some side channel sites in places like Logger Creek, Dry Creek, Harris Creek, and I'll show you those on a map here shortly. And so we've got 5 years of data looking at this. We've started this in 2015, and we've done it clear through last fall, and we're going to continue to do these surveys going forward for a handful of years. Pretty interesting data. So these are the fish per square meter now. We're not doing 100 meters squared anymore because we're talking about smaller areas, but this is how many rainbow and brown trout we capture per square meter in these surveys by year. And you can see that it changes drastically from year to year. You think of 2017, which was that really high flow year. It really knocked our brown trout back because of those high spring flows. One of the things I talked about earlier was I mentioned that brown trout tend to not do as well in the Boise River because of the flow conditions. So brown trout are fall spawners. Rainbow trout spawn in the spring. They typically spawn in that April-May window, even in March. And then those fish are emerging from the gravel in that June to July window. So they're a spring spawner. Brown trout are fall spawners. So they're typically spawning in like late October through November. Those fish are in the gravel through the winter, and then they'll start emerging usually in February. And so in the lower Boise, where in a year like 2017, where we bump it from base winter flows up to, 7, 8, 9, even sometimes 10,000 CFS in February for flood control measures, we're basically kind of knocking all those little brown trout fry that are emerging from the gravel down through the system. And we see survival kind of plummet when that happens. And so 2017 was an example of that. But with all those high flows we got in 2017, moving gravel around and creating some new spawning areas and cleaning up spawning areas, we saw the highest densities of both rainbow trout and brown trout in 2018 following those high flows. And so that was really promising to see that we had kind of a bumper crop of fry because of all of the new gravels for spawning. Fast forward to 2019, and it was a little more depressing. We saw the lowest number of rainbow that we'd seen and the second lowest of brown. Brown trout, again, we had some high spring flows. The interesting thing with rainbows in 2019 is we had kind of a freak storm in June of 2019. And right in the heart of when those rainbows would have kind of been emerging from the gravel, the river went up by about 3,000 CFS in a day because of the reservoirs were all full, and we had this big storm and all this water was coming into the system. And so they were forced to kind of flush some flood control water down the river. And it just so happened that was pretty poor timing for our rainbow emergence. And we think that really knocked that year class back a little bit. So we'll keep doing this going forward. It's been kind of interesting for us to correlate our fry production with river conditions, and that's something that we're going to continue to do. This is a chart that Tim put together, and I kind of like it. It's basically you're looking. It would be if you're standing above the Boise River looking down, Harris Ranch, and the upper end would be up here. And then as you go down river, you get to Loggers Creek area here. And what you're looking at is the blue dots are rainbow densities. The pinkish looking dots are brown trout fry densities. And the bigger the splot, the higher the densities. And you can see that, you know, most of our rainbow are produced in this upper stretch down to about Glenwood. We get both rainbows and browns in Loggers Creek and in that section through Boise. Then as you leave Glenwood and head down towards Eagle, you're really talking mostly brown trout production. And that's where you see a lot of your brown trout fry. So that's kind of I always thought that was kind of a cool graph to kind of visually look at where most of our fry production is occurring throughout the system. So just to summarize that, wild rainbow fry densities are greatest upriver of Eagle, brown fry greatest downriver of Eagle. We do find much higher densities in the side channel and tributary habitat, and that just further kind of enforces this idea of us continuing to look for opportunities to improve those habitats. The Boise River is very side channel limited, and so where we do have those channels, we find a lot of trout production, but channelized sections don't produce as many trout. Densities are fairly low, but fry are large. So, you know, our fry in the lower Boise River, the rule of thumb with trout fry is you want them to be about 100 millimeters before winter to survive through the winter. And a lot of our fry are in that 110, 120 millimeter range. So they are big, healthy fry, the ones that are there. There's just not a lot of them. The other thing that we started in 2020 is a hatchery egg box supplementation program. So we have a lot of eyed eggs in our hatchery system that we end up just kind of tossing each year because we take more than we need in case we have survival issues. And then we fill up our hatcheries and we have excess that we usually just get rid of. And so hatchery folks approached the managers and said, hey, we've got all these eggs every year that we're just tossing. Is there any place in the state where we might be able to use them? And so that was pretty exciting for us over here because we knew that the Boise River was production limited. And so starting this year, we put some egg boxes out. And we put about 10,000 trout eggs out in those egg boxes. We did some in Barber and some down by below Esther Simplot. We kind of wanted to try a good area and a not so good area. So Barber's our good area that we're supplementing. And that Willow Lane, Esther Simplot stretch, which is really channelized, is kind of our poor area that we're supplementing. And research technology being what it is, we now have the ability, when these fish are eggs, you can actually take them out of the water and stick them in like a wet towel on a countertop for a few hours and then put them back in the water and then take them out again. And every time you do that, they lay down a mark on their otolith. So otoliths are little bone structures inside of at the base of a fish's brain. And so we can actually put a barcode on each fish's otolith based on where we put the egg in the river. So fish that went to Barber got one barcode. Fish that went to Esther Simplot got another barcode. And as those fish mature, if we want to sacrifice a few of those fish when we encounter them in the river, we can pull their otoliths out, look at them under a microscope, and we can tell which group they came from or if they were indeed from our supplementation efforts. And so we're able to basically batch mark fish in large quantities that way, which is pretty cool technology. So I skipped this in the I didn't have any mountain whitefish slides when I gave this talk out at Star, and one of the people in the audience asked me about whitefish, and I realized I'd kind of just neglected to include that. We're not neglecting the whitefish, and starting in 2018, we're doing trend monitoring of 3 sites for whitefish as well. And so we basically staggered these so that it's an off year from our trout surveys. And we have 3-kilometer sites that we're surveying for whitefish the same way we do the trout surveys with our big canoe shocker going down. We're not doing mark recapture for those. Whitefish don't tend to do as well with mark recapture. And so we're just doing a single pass and looking at catch per unit effort. And we're going to sample these sites every 3 years. And I guess the take home is, since we don't have trend data because we just started this, is that the initial surveys in 18 show that the whitefish population in the lower Boise appears healthy. And you can see down here, we've got pretty good densities of various age classes of whitefish, and some all the way up to 450 millimeters. So that was promising to see, and we'll gain data on those guys going forward. Kind of just getting down to the last few slides here. We do bring adult steelhead into the river every year when we have them available. I think last year was one of the first years in quite a while that we didn't have steelhead available because of the state of our anadromous returns right now. But typically we'll bring 100 to 600 adult steelhead from Oxbow Hatchery over to the Boise in the fall. Usually that occurs in November, and we'll release them at up to 5 locations. This is the truck releasing them at BSU. You can see this guy's already caught one right after release. That's West Park Center Bridge. This is right below Americana Diversion. We'll usually put them at Glenwood and Barber as well. And so that's a pretty popular program for us to bring those fish in. They get caught in high numbers relatively quickly. And you can see by the number of anglers stacked up here that it's pretty popular for our local fishermen. Briefly talk about the Barber Dam mitigation. I think it was back in 2014 that Barber Dam went offline, had a power trip, and in the course of water not going through the dam and the pool behind the dam refilling, the flow in the river dropped significantly. You can see that the river was almost dried up here in this picture. There was a settlement that occurred out of that, and from the settlement funds, we did a bunch of habitat work to the Boise by Barber Park, right below Eckert Diversion. And so this is just an engineering mock-up of what that habitat improvement looked like. We put in a bunch of sunken woody debris and boulder complexes to provide small fish habitat. This is kind of what it looked like after the fact, with all these rocks were added in. Both sides of the river, there's woody debris added. And unfortunately, we didn't have any pre-habitat work surveys, but we do know that it's increased fry densities up there, and this is kind of what the fry densities have looked like in 16 and 17 following that work. And you can see that our wild rainbow densities have gotten pretty high in that stretch. So I said I'd briefly talk about the fishery below Middleton, the warm water fishery. And when I say briefly, I have one slide that you're looking at dedicated to that. So sport fish in that stretch down there are predominantly smallmouth bass and channel catfish. There are other non-game fish present, like suckers and carp. And so that stretch of river, it's actually a pretty good warm water fishery. I guess the biggest hold up down there is access is very limited. We don't have near the access that we have to the upper stretch of the river. And so folks that are willing to kind of go down there and float it, or take a jet boat and access certain areas, or just fish around the limited access that we have, they can do pretty well, especially on smallmouth, and it can be a pretty good warm water fishery. Ongoing opportunities for improvement. One of the things you're looking at, some Mississippi grass shrimp in this picture right here. So in the course of our fry surveys, I think in 2017, we discovered near Warm Lake Golf Course that there were some Mississippi grass shrimp. And so those are aquarium species that were probably introduced through the aquarium trade. Somebody had them and either decided to try to use some as bait, or they had them in an aquarium or didn't want them and they went and dumped them. And so this is a gravid female right here. You can see she's full of eggs. And so we've seen these guys in subsequent surveys. And I guess the moral of the story is that they're probably here to stay. They don't get very big. We don't think they're going to really have any sort of large-scale ecological impact on the river. Trout will probably love them and eat them, I'm sure. But just kind of the moral of the story there is that we do continue to see these random introductions where people think they're just doing something innocent by dumping something in a water body, and then it takes hold, and then we're forced with having to deal with an exotic introduced species. So we're always looking for continued work to increase and improve habitat complexity. Fish and Game does not have a whole lot of budgeting to put towards resident trout habitat improvements. And so a lot of times we're looking for partners, or looking for funding sources, or looking for ways to get that done, whether it's through the various cities or clubs or whatever we can, to try to look for opportunities to improve habitat. Things like side channel and sinuosity improvements, thoughts about repurposing of gravel deposits. One of the interesting things about the lower Boise is there's really no gravel input. You think of places like the South Fork that gets South Fork Boise that has all these high elevation tributaries that blow out from time to time and introduce gravel. There's really no major tributaries to the lower Boise, and especially none that will flow high and introduce a bunch of gravel during flood control. And so the gravel that's in there is kind of the gravel that's there. And so a lot of times when, you know, we're removing gravel for diversions or doing what we're doing, we're just kind of creating a deficit of gravel. And so we want to look for opportunities to, if we need to move gravel, maybe repurposing it from one section of the river to the other, and just trying to find ways to keep our gravels in the river, because obviously those are very important from a fisheries perspective. I mentioned way early on in the talk about increased winter flows. We're working with DOR on the Lucky Peak water right to use a little more of the water that we hold. So with the 240 CFS that we put down the river annually from mid-October through when flood control starts or when irrigation deliveries start April 1, we only use about half of that account annually. And so we're looking at modeling using 3/4 of that account so that we'll still have some carryover water, but we're trying to get winter flows bumped up to that 350 CFS range. We're going to have to go through the NEPA process and obviously vet all of that, and we've started that, but that'll take a couple years to complete. But looking at increasing winter flows, and that's something that's ongoing. Always looking for opportunities to reduce early flood control releases because those are detrimental to our brown trout population. And then continuing to monitor use given valley growth. I talked about us getting out and tagging fish again this year to look at angling pressure, and that's something that we're going to continue to look at and pay attention to. And then the other one that's big in the Boise is improving our understanding of entrainment and stranding. So we've got, I mentioned earlier, we've got these 30 canals and diversions. None of our canals are screened in the Boise drainage. And so we get a lot of fish that end up in our canal system. And then of course in the fall, those canals are dried up. Canals are private property, so we can't really issue salvage orders for people to go access those fish because they're private property. And so really those fish end up just most of the time dying in those canals. And a lot of it's non-game fish, but you still see trout in the canals as well. And so we really were hoping to maybe get a grad student study or getting a large scale study underway to try to monitor how much entrainment is occurring in the valley and see if we can move towards improving the entrainment levels for our fish. And so with that, of course, I've got my questions tab in here because I'm always giving this in person in front of an audience, but I don't know if we wanted to open it up for questions, Liz, or how we wanted to handle that, but that's all I've got for slides.
Excellent. Excellent, John. That's just a fabulous presentation. I'm going to let John catch his breath, and we do already have some questions in the chat. And if you have a question, put it into the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. Again, this is Liz Paul. I'm the coordinator for Boise River Enhancement Network, and we appreciate everybody coming to our program today. Some people joined after it got started. It's been recorded, and it shouldn't be too long, like later today, where I get that posted back up on our Facebook page and onto our website, that recording, so you can either see the part that you missed or you can watch it all over again, and you can share it around and show it in a classroom or whatever. Okay, John's caught his breath. So we have a question. That's first question: what factors differentiate the fishery in the South Fork Boise River versus the lower Boise River as it goes through town?
So I guess there's a few differences in those two fisheries. The South Fork fishery typically tends to be a colder fishery, even through the summer months. The water coming out of Anderson is a little colder than the water coming out of Lucky Peak. And so in general, you're talking about an even colder, cold water fishery. We manage the South Fork fishery as a trophy fishery. So it's all catch and release, with I think the exception of maybe you can keep one fish over a certain size. I don't have the regs in front of me, but it's mainly a catch and release fishery and a trophy fishery. And so that fishery has higher densities of fish. It's mainly just a rainbow fishery as well, similar genetics to the rainbows that you'd find in the lower Boise, with a little more probably native red band mixed in. There are bull trout in that stretch of river as well, and so anglers will encounter bull trout. And then of course there's some trophy whitefish there as well. But really it's just a difference in management. We manage that as a catch and release kind of trophy type fishery, and we manage the lower Boise as more of a general fishery, just to give anglers more of a variety. And so you'll see higher densities of trout in the South Fork, probably a higher component, well not probably, you do see a higher component of trophy fishery in the South Fork. And that's mostly due to the fact that it's a little bit colder water. So it's a little bit better habitat, better spawning habitat because of the gravel inputs that it gets from the tributaries. So you see a higher natural reproduction up there. And then it's all mostly catch and release. And so there's not fish being removed from the system. So those are the main differences between those two fisheries.
Great. That's great. And then another question, which you might have already answered, it came in a while ago, but you talked about how increased winter flows improve the fishery. And then the person asks, what are today's limiting factors for cold water fisheries in the lower Boise River?
Yeah, and so I mean, so I talked about winter flows, and I probably already answered that question. We've always said that's kind of maybe the most limiting factor in the wild trout population, because that's really the choke point, those low flows in the winter. When you're talking about a channelized river and you lower the flows to 240 CFS or 150 CFS, most of the water is in the middle of that channel, and so you lose a lot of your kind of riparian vegetation covered habitat along the margins. You have some of that still on the bends and the corners where the river still hits those points, but a lot of your riffles and runs kind of end up out in the middle of a exposed channel. And so your fish have higher rates of predation. They don't have as many places to hide. On to the second part of that question, as far as what's limiting the cold water. I mean, I guess the water is as cold as it is because it's coming out of the bottom end of Lucky Peak Reservoir. So I wouldn't say anything's really limiting that. Once it hits the river, of course, there's sun exposure and there's riparian habitat. But for what the Boise River is, and that's, you know, a channelized urban river, we've done a pretty good job of maintaining riparian cover and habitat for an urbanized river. And so you still are getting warmer than maybe you would in a truly natural wild environment where you've got more sinuosity and braiding and side channel habitat, and that's obvious. But there's not a whole lot we can do now to decrease the temperatures from what they are, outside of just looking to further improve side channel habitat and existing habitat. But in that section from Middleton upriver, I wouldn't really say that we're temperature limited. That stretch of river is pretty suitable temperature wise for trout populations. It's more of the winter flows and the spawning habitat. Those are really our biggest limitations.
Excellent. And we do have about 5 questions here lined up. What portion of your funding comes from fishing licenses?
So I would say for my particular, I don't know if that's a department-wide question or for Region 3 fisheries, I get probably about 90% of my funding for my program from the Dingell-Johnson DJ funding. So that's a excise tax placed on fishing gear, Dingell-Johnson Act from the 1970s. Basically, all the states get a cut of an excise tax that's placed on. If you go buy a boat, if you go buy a fishing rod, if you go buy tackle, you're taxed on all of that. And so the state agencies get funds from that. And so a lot of my budget comes from that, but I also get license dollars as well. I would say it's probably about 70%, 80% DJ money and about 20% license money.
Excellent. From Sam asks that you had talked about how 2019 was a bad year for trout, both the adult and the fry, and you explained about the fry getting impacted by high flows. Why was it a bad year for the adult trout, 2019?
We don't know. I don't know that we know the answer to that yet. That's one of the reasons why we're wanting to further monitor angler use and exploitation. I'm not implying that I think that anglers are pulling all the fish out of the river. There's a lot of fish out there and people have been fishing the river for a long time. But we do want to make sure that, you know, with our increased pressure and increased use, that maybe anglers aren't driving that population down more than we want them to because of the increased pressure. And so we think maybe some of that's going on, but I would be hesitant to say that's the whole story. There is always variation in our samples as well. And I guess that's one of the things you always want to point out as a scientist is when I showed you that graph, you know, these big black lines that you see on that graph, that's variation around our estimates. And so every estimate you do has variation around it. And so these aren't absolute numbers. And in 2008, those numbers could have actually been, or 2010, they could have very well been down here somewhere. And so there's always variation around your estimates too. You see the lower our estimates, the tighter the variation. So for this most recent survey, we had pretty tight variance around that. But there's a few things that are going on. Estimates aren't absolute. Anecdotally, it seems like the fish are doing pretty well. Anglers are not like people are going out and struggling to catch fish in the Boise. It's been some of the best fishing that I've seen in a long time. And one of the benefits of this year, without the flood control releases or the high runoff, is the Boise through towns remained fishable basically through the entirety of the spring, which is not common for the lower Boise. Usually, by March, it's flowing so high we can't fish it. And so people are able to get out and they're doing really well. And so we don't know how much of that is true, and that is the population really decreased that much, or is there some sampling error there? And so we'll continue to monitor it and see, but we want to make sure that anglers aren't having too much of an impact and there isn't something else going on there. But recruitment, for the most part, looks pretty good, and we'll see. Time will tell.
Excellent. Hey, Tyler King, I'm going to ask you to, if you still want him to talk more about temperature, to write that into the chat. And in the meantime, a couple of different questions came in. People really interested to know what, Chris Rain asks, do you have a good feel for which issue is the primary limiting factor, and if improved, would result in the biggest improvements? Mike Humza asks, what type of projects can Bren do to improve the lower Boise River fishery? And then we have another question about
Right.
Barber Pool, but let's start with those questions.
So I would say that the biggest, from our perspective, the biggest limiting factor right now are still winter flows. We think that's the biggest choke point in the river. And so we're working to improve that with the increased flow, and we're going to monitor trout population response. But I mean, we saw in the mid 90s, we went from 150 CFS right in this window right here to 240 CFS. And you can see what happened to the population following that increase in winter flows. And so do we have evidence that that increase was entirely due to the increased winter flow? No, we can't say that definitively, but we think it definitely had an impact. And so we think going from the 240 up to that 350 range is going to also increase the trout population, because we think that the winter flow is the greatest limiting factor. And that's one that we can address. As I mentioned, if you're talking brown trout, I think some of the way the water is released down through the river might limit fish, but human safety and a lot of the issues that we deal with in the valley when it comes to water are going to trump how we do trout management. And so flood control releases are kind of necessary when it comes to managing this system. And so those are issues that impact the trout, but they're also, public safety and human safety issues for the river corridor that we just have to try to work around. And so I think spawning is another one, but I think, again, we're trying to address that by doing these egg box supplementations. And I think we can add more fry to the system pretty easily in doing that, and increase the productivity of the river as well. As far as how groups can help, whether it's a brand or whether it's another group, that's a tough one to answer. There's always little things we can do, but a lot of the habitat improvements, side channel reconnectivity or anything like that, these are big, projects that are thousands upon thousands of dollars. And so it's difficult for smaller groups that have limited funds to, they can contribute to some of these projects, partially. And a lot of times if you can get enough groups together, maybe you can track something down. But these big projects that would really probably move the dial are hard to fund because they're expensive and they require a lot of work. And so little things, I think Bren does a great job of just raising awareness of, what the river is and what it can be and what it provides, and just getting people to recognize that, we've got this pretty special river that flows through Boise, and it needs to be treated that way, and getting public education out there on kind of what the river is, and those sorts of things are always beneficial from our perspective.
Thank you. And then this may be the last issue. So talking about the relicensing of Barber Dam.
Yep.
And the fact that there is no fish passage at Barber Dam, And
Yep.
then also, of course, at Barber Dam creates Barber Pool. And so can you talk a little bit about the health of the fishery in Barber Pool, and are there some improvements that Fish and Game may be looking for as that hydropower project gets relicensed by the federal government?
Yeah, so the pool supports a healthy trout population. There is no fish passage, and so it's kind of interesting to think that, well, how are we getting spawning up there, and how do we have a naturally producing fish population up there? But we do. There's enough of an input of fish. You'll have fish that entrain through Lucky Peak. You've got all of the area above diversion that supports a fish population. And so we see pretty good densities of fish in the pool. If you're a fly fisherman, you know that like going up to High Bridge and fishing below diversion dam can be some of the better fly fishing in the river at times. And so the pool itself has a healthy fish population. There's some big fish in there. The biggest thing that we've worked with the city on and the power company on is just trying to limit flow interruptions. And I think they've done a great job of being more responsive to that. We don't see, we talked about the river drying up back in 2014, and that type of interruption is really not seen anymore. They're very responsive to power outages and getting that facility back online. And so we'll see some fluctuations in flow from time to time if we have power outages there. But for the most part, the power company and the city or in the county have done a really good job of working through those hurdles, and it seems to be for the better. So, we don't really take a stance one way or another, obviously, in this whole process. Our job as a Fish and Wildlife Management Agency is just to provide data on the population and what we see. And we have a healthy fish population below the dam, and we have a healthy fish population above the dam. And if we can limit flow interruptions, we think we can maintain those healthy populations. And that's kind of what we see and what we know when it comes to Barber Pool.
Excellent, excellent. We do have one last question before we let you go. I am going to say then to everybody, of course, thank you. And this is recorded, and it'll be put onto our Facebook page and onto the Boise River Enhancement Network webpage, that link. So Scott Peterson asks, should fishing pressure prove to be a major impact on fish population, what are the chances politically to change the regulations to catch and release?
So yeah, we go through a rule cycle every 5 years. We're about midway through that rule cycle right now. I think our next rule making for fisheries would be 2020. And so any of our special reg waters, whether it's the South Fork, whether it's even the section between East and West Park Center, we are a data-driven agency and biologically driven. And so if we wouldn't be able to make a change, nor would we want to make a change if we don't see an angler impact, which is why we're doing the work that we're doing, because we want to know the answer to that question. But if we do this work and we see that all of a sudden, we went from a 2 or 3% trout exploitation from our last tagging in 15 and 16, and all of a sudden now we've got a 15 or 20 or 30% trout exploitation going on for our wild trout population, there would be pressure for us, and we would recommend some sort of rule modification. I don't know that we would go 100% catch and release. Maybe we'd add more catch and release areas. Maybe we would just reduce the bag limit from 6 to 2. There's lots of different management tools, I guess, in our pocket to utilize to change harvest behavior. And so, but if the data tells us that there's an impact there, then there's no doubt that we would make a run at changing that. And if the data supports it, we're pretty confident in our ability to do that. I guess just to quickly give you an example of our most recent change, Deadwood Reservoir is our major kokanee provider for eggs across the state for our kokanee program, and it had a 25 fish limit on it because historically it was overpopulated with small kokanee and not a whole lot of anglers were willing to drag their boats up there. And that rule was getting a little outdated. More and more people were making the trip up there, were catching their 75 possession limit of fish. And we went and did a creel survey, and we found that about half of the population in a given year was being pulled out by anglers, and it was limiting our ability to collect eggs and provide kokanee for the rest of the state. And so we proposed dropping that from 25 to 15 and changing the possession limit from 75 to 45. And had overwhelming support for that, and got that rule changed in the last rulemaking cycle. And so typically you'll find that more conservative rules for fishing are supported. And so we don't have a lot of pushback if we decide to try to change a rule, if we've got the biological data to support it. And that's always the key piece.
And on that fabulous piece of information, you guys, hey, join me in, thanking John. You can say thanks in the chat box. You can just give a virtual thanks. We really appreciate his time today and his expertise and all of the work that Idaho Fish and Game does. The Boise River through town and down to the Snake River is really an amazing resource, and it's just incredible that there are so many fish in the river, native fish in the river. We're very fortunate. We're very fortunate folks. So look for this recording if you want to watch it again or miss some of it or want to share it with somebody, and make sure you join so you get our emails and don't miss our upcoming programs, which Cassidy and Jane and other volunteers are working on now. So John, you can look and you're getting a lot of thanks there in the chat box.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. I appreciate it. And obviously, if you ever got any questions, feel free to call our office. I'm always available and happy to chat.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.